And there we are. We're live.
Right.
Hi, everyone. I'm here with my friend Keith for another episode of Coaching Conversation. And today we're going to talk about building executive presence, which I'm really excited to talk about because I know that this is something that a lot of people are really interested in. So Keith, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself because you're going to do it so much better than I could.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Todd. So I am a career coach, and I've been doing this for about 4 years now. Prior to coaching, I spent almost 25 years as an executive search consultant. I was a partner in some of the very large global executive search firms. So spent my days not only working with major clients that needed to hire senior professionals. By the way, it was in the financial services industry. I managed the search process, so spent, dozens and dozens and dozens of engagements working with senior executives and, marshaling them through a process, which frankly, I think kind of lend itself to my decision to move into coaching. So I'm a full-time career coach for the past 4 years because of my background in executive search. Of course, I took some time to put a method around the madness of coaching. I figured, it's one thing just being a search guy and then saying, hey, here I am as a career coach. It's another thing to say, okay, there's got to be a process around coaching, which indeed there is. And I got my, training at the Coactive Training Institute and got my certifications through ICF and all of that. So, so that's where I am.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Well, and like, I'm going to be honest with you, and you know this, and I'll just tell everyone else too. It's your background in executive search that made me specifically want to have this conversation with you, because you have an exposure to probably a wider assortment, like a wider population of executive leaders than most people do. And which means, I'm making up that you have some strong opinions on, what executive presence is and what it isn't.
I think I do. Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't we start there? Because the thing is, it's like executive presence can mean a million things to a million different people. So, when you think of executive presence, particularly in your role and with your, what does it mean to you?
Well, it's interesting. You and I were talking about this before we started this a few minutes ago. And I actually liked what you said, although I think I intuitively got it. But you said, let's not, in your mind, and actually in my mind, it's not, there's two pieces to executive presence. There's the executive and there's the presence.
Right.
And you pointed out that it's the presence part that in a sense is most important. And I agree with that. Executive presence. And I think of the word executive, I almost take the word executive and drop in leader or leadership, leadership presence, and leadership, just to get the executive part out of the way, or leadership doesn't have to be, I'm the boss of a big group. Leadership can be done at any level with peers, with subordinates. Leadership is helping to marshal others in a collaborative enterprise. To a goal. So that's what leadership is, right? Now the presence, which is what we really want to talk about. How do you build presence, or what is presence, right? So I'll throw in a couple of things that I believe are embedded in presence, and there's going to be some others, but and maybe we can define these a little bit. But empathy, listening, and I don't know what order we want to put these in, and what I would call self-assurance and self-confidence. Now, the self-assurance and self-confidence is internal to the person. Empathy is an understanding, right? But having an orientation outwardly, having an understanding of other people. Some people call it emotional intelligence, but having that kind of an intuitive understanding of people and their emotions, or how they're reacting to something, or what kind of state they're in. So that's both sort of internal, but it's also appreciating the external. Listening is, again, it's a two-way street as well. That is
Mhm.
really spending the time to hear. Listening is hearing the other person. And I think that's when I think of presence, those are some of the elements that people that we perceive sort of have this
Yep.
idea of presence that are
Yep.
embedded in them. So what do you think of
Yeah.
those three? Or how do you think?
I actually, so I love that. It's almost like a trifecta, in terms of what presence is. And I also really like the way that you've sort of picked the adjective, right? You know, like it's executive presence, but it could be leadership. It could be, you know, a leader's presence or something like that. And what's interesting is, like this buzzy term that we call executive presence, right? Is I know it's exciting, and I know it's exciting to people like on LinkedIn, especially. And I mentioned this before we started, because I know that when I tag a post with executive presence, you know, lots of people are interested in it. And what I've started to realize is that there's this expectation, like you said, that, you know, executive presence is something that I need if I have my eye on an executive leadership position, like the C-suite or some vice president or whatever. And what I'm hearing in how you're describing it is this is a skill that we do well to cultivate well before we get there. And you know, empathy, I think, is a really good one, and self-assuredness is really good too. And I might add self-compassion in there,
So somewhat.
because self-compassion,
Oh yeah, okay.
you know, like giving us, right? Because you know, I think, you know, the other element that often sort of exists or coexists with this is sort of an expectation of getting things right. And one of the hard things, for me anyway, one of the hard things about presence is staying present when I've screwed up, and not beating myself up about it, because I think, like, I'm going to screw up. And, you know, this is, and you know this, like, you know, my coaching business is a year and a half old. I haven't been doing it for as long as you have. And yeah, and you know, from time to time I screw up at things. Of course I do, right? You know, and in my corporate career, I made fewer mistakes towards the end, I guess. But that's just because, you know, I had decades of experience.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that. Tiny little story. I was just speaking to a client who this client I just a couple of days ago in a session. And I happen to think this person has good presence, executive presence. I mean, but by no means sort of, you know, some loud, you know, manager. I mean, just a really good way about him. Very thoughtful. When you're talking to him, you know that this person is quite capable. And you feel like they're speaking from authority. But one of the things you mentioned, which is directly what you just said about self-compassion, he said he spent a fair amount of time the last few years thinking about how do I, or not how do I, but putting aside when he makes mistakes. In other words, coming to the realization that you're going to make mistakes. It happens all the time. We talked a lot about, you know, when you have to make decisions as a manager or even as an independent contributor, you don't have all the information. So there's some intuition involved with, you know, coming to a decision. But once you do it, you do it. And and that idea, that self-compassion, which you were just, that's what he was talking about, the idea that, look, I'm going to make mistakes. And when they happen, all right, don't beat myself up. We did the best we could with the information, but then also having the self-assurance in his instance, where he always feels that he'll be able to overcome if something, you know, happens because of a decision. They'll figure out how to move. They'll figure out, he's comfortable that he can figure out how to move forward after that. But it's both self-compassion and self-assurance.
And trust.
Yeah.
Like that, like when you were saying that, it's like the word trust just popped into my head, like, you know, with neon lights. Yeah. And what's interesting to me is all of these things, like whether it's empathy, and I think empathy maybe comes after some of these things. Like it's hard to cultivate empathy for someone else when I struggle to cultivate empathy for myself.
Okay.
And
Yeah. Yep.
well, and if I think about it, and this is my own story. Like I think of my own leadership journey within, my corporate career. And, in the times in my life when I was inclined to look at the things that I did and say, oh, how can I make such a stupid mistake? Or, or just really beat myself up because of this or that or something else. It was very easy for me in those moments to hold my direct reports to impossibly high standards, like just impossibly high standards.
Right.
I mean, I'm laughing now. I shouldn't laugh. It was a terrible thing. But once I was able to kind of take a step back and think, oh, you know what? It's okay. It's okay that I don't know this thing. It's okay that I need to learn this thing. It's okay that I need to ask for help. Then suddenly it's possible to do that with other people as well. And if I think of the leaders to whom I've reported, like the executive leaders who have been, my mentors, who have been the most successful in my eyes, it's the ones who were able to sort of create that space where it was okay for me to make a mistake. And right. And, when I think of the application of executive presence, that is kind of the thing, like that was the differentiator. Could I go to my leader, whoever that person is in whatever role they have, could I go to my leader with something that is, a mistake, with something that's a problem, with something, where I need help, and do it without feeling like I'll be berated. And and it's interesting because there is this mythology. I don't know, I can't think of a better word, but there's this mythology that, when I'm in that executive position, I will exert my leadership through my positional authority because, I've got the title. So the title gives me the authority to do and be the leader that I want to be, whatever that is. And if I haven't cultivated the presence that we're talking about, then that can become very toxic very quickly.
Yep. Well, it's well, it's interesting because there are people in leadership positions that may not have the best executive presence, although not usually.
Oh, you think?
But it happens. It happens. Yeah. So that executive presence, that presence, although I was equating the executive portion to leadership, but that presence isn't. The executive presence helps with the execution of good leadership.
Yeah.
It's not the leadership itself.
Yes.
But it will help with being a good leader, is having that. To be a good leader, you kind of have to have that good, what I would call good, strong presence.
Right.
Which is, again, self-compassion, right? Understanding yourself, which also leads to your self-assurance and your self-confidence. And people see that.
Yeah.
And people naturally want to follow someone that, that is sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, if they're sure, then I feel more sure. I mean, it's just, it's what you do.
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. No, don't be sorry. It's just did you finish your thought? Because I do want to.
Well, I was going to say, human beings, we all look to other people to see how we should act.
Yes.
Right? Whether you know it or not. We spend all our days looking at other people in the eyes, watching people on television, watching people at the store, talking to other people, going to parties and talking to people. And all of that is about, well, am I acting the right way? How do these people act? Yeah. We all look at others for cues on what is getting. When we see certain self-assurance, it's okay.
And what I love about that is when I witness self-assurance, then, or when I'm really feeling self-assured, which I'm going to admit is, that's something that's fairly new for me. But when I'm really feeling self-assured, then sort of that comparison becomes less important, doesn't it? Right? Like, we're always watching other people, and at the same time, even if I witness something that's different from the way that I might respond in a situation, I can be okay with that. And I think that's interesting. I think this is related to what I wanted to introduce, because as you were talking about, sort of, executive presence being a way of being, um, the thing, like the phrase that immediately popped into my head was "fake it till you make it," which is advice that I received countless times over my career, and and I'm curious what you think, because I have a strong opinion on this one, but I'd like to know what yours is before I jump in.
Fake it till you make it. I think my reaction to that is you can fake it for only so long.
Yes.
It tends to be superficial, and it could be at first blush, okay, I get it, and that I get that person. But as you get underneath the surface, if there isn't as much substance there, that can be seen pretty quickly, I think, at some point, or it might be seen sometimes after it's too late, and which is not going to be a good outcome. Either.
Yeah, yeah, and thank you, because I mean, we're on the same page. I received and consumed the advice "fake it till you make it" many, many times, and really, what happened for me was it activated an imposter syndrome in a place that it didn't really need to exist, right? Self-assurance and self-knowledge and self-compassion went out the door when it felt like I had to create a performance in order to trick someone into believing that I knew what I was doing. And the negative effect of that was it made it less possible for me to ask for help. And I think that's and because I've presented myself as someone who knows what's going on, who knows the thing, and what I can also say is that in those situations where I found myself within that mindset, it was again really difficult to create safety within the context of the team, because I was so busy projecting authority, whatever that is, within the context of what's going on. And the word authentic is coming up as I think about, like, what is executive presence and what's important about it, and authentic is another one of those words that I sometimes struggle with, because I think it can mean a bunch of different things. But within this context, it's, am I really being true to myself? And I think it's back to presence. Like, am I present to whatever it is that's going on right now without judgment, because it's okay?
Yeah.
We're all emotional beings, even executives, even leaders.
Yep.
Possibly especially executives and leaders.
Right. And I agree with all that. There are some aspects of, I think, this executive presence that obviously strong technical knowledge about the field that you're in. These are important things. Plus the ability to, which we haven't touched on, the ability to communicate well.
Yeah.
It's hard to have good executive presence. Now, again, I think people that tend to have good executive presence, I say, have some empathy, are good at listening, just because people feel a certain way in their presence, and I think that helps. But the idea of being a pretty good communicator, kind of speaking in a logical train of thought. I certainly always looked at that when I was in the executive search. How does a person communicate? What they do, or their skills or their responsibilities, and how do they? How does that come across? And some of that can be taught. But that also, some of that goes to that idea of self-assurance, understanding yourself and being comfortable, and then be able to communicate appropriately. Communications is certainly part of executive presence and how you communicate.
Yeah. Well, and certainly anyone in a leadership position, whether it's an executive leadership position or something else, communication is an essential skill. So yes, I agree with everything you're saying. But what's coming to me as you're talking about this, Keith, is that it's almost like there's a two-parter. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but it feels like, let's say I'm, a mid-career person and I want to develop executive presence because I would like to grow my career into, a, C-suite or VP position or something like that. And like, if I'm kind of trying to be tactical here and saying, okay, what next? Like, what do I do? It sounds like there's a 1-2 punch. And the first one is, am I comfortable in my skin? Can I be present to me? And can I cultivate these, self-compassion, self-authority, all of that, all of the things that we were talking about. Do I have empathy for the people around me? Do I have empathy for myself? And then after that, like, once I'm sort of on that journey, then I can start thinking about, the other things, right? Am I a strong communicator?
Yep.
Do I have, like, that sort of thing. So it's sort of it's not either or, it's really, 1-2.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. No, I mean, you have to start with those foundational building blocks about your own self-awareness and, what are your sort of saboteurs or blockages that, kind of prevent you from sort of being your full self, if you will.
Right.
Which all has to do with values and things of that nature. But yeah, I agree with you. You can't have a strong executive presence without a deep understanding of yourself and your strengths and your weaknesses, those kinds of things about yourself, and being honest about it. Look, let me tell you, again, starting that executive presence is part of leadership qualities.
Yes.
Good leaders also know what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are, and they play to their strengths, and they get a good team around them. And part of that team is also managing the leader's weaknesses. In other words, I'm not good at this, so I got to make sure I've got one of my people that's really good at this, because I don't really get that. I don't really know how to do that. In fact, I know how to do it, but I hate doing that. So I better have a good person on the team that's really, that part of what they're doing is really good at that, because that's one of my weaknesses. And that's not executive presence, but it's part of leadership.
Well, however, I mean, it is. So yes, I agree with you. It's not specifically executive presence. And at the same time, when I think of the very best executives that I've worked with, the thing that they have in common is exactly that, like self-knowledge, in the sense that, I know that I'm good at this. I know that I am not good at or don't like that. And will create sort of the support structure, the team around them that allows them to operate at their best within, and that self-knowledge is required in order to do that. And the flip side, if I were to say, like the most challenging executives that I've ever worked with, the ones that have had the most difficulty in other aspects, like whether that's communication or whether that's building fellowship or whatever, are the ones who tend not to want to be told that they're wrong, who tend not to want to be challenged, and will create that team around them of people who will do what they're told. And the thing is and then the limitation becomes, like, I'm limited by whatever my skills happen to be. So, and that does speak back to self-knowledge. That does speak back to what am I willing to accept about myself? And the truth is I have to accept all of it, don't I? In order to be strong in that space.
Some of the to amplify something, part of what you just said, this idea of sort of strengths and weaknesses, and knowing, when I was in the search business, the best conversations with senior people, and all of them had it, that you could tell they were great managers, and they had risen to, pretty senior roles. They all knew their limitations, and they would say it right out. Like when you're interviewing for a job, they would say right up front, okay, well, these are the areas for that role that I'm really good at. But by the way, I'm not good at this stuff. And it wasn't, and it would never hide. It's like, my strength is not there. And if you need that, then I'm not your guy. I'm just making that up. But I mean, there was those kinds of conversations where there was implicit in the conversation of, where their strengths, but also being completely comfortable talking about their weaknesses. And even early stage career people need to, there's a tendency to try to kind of hide some of the things you don't know, as opposed to saying, I don't know that. I'm not good at that. I haven't been trained in that yet. If that's what you need, that's not me, but I'm really good at this stuff. So it's that self-awareness, but it's the ability to also say it, or the understanding that, you are who you are. You are who you are. Your strengths and weaknesses are what they are, or at least at this point. They can change over time.
For sure. Well, yeah. I mean, you can train. You can get training in anything you want. But what I love about what you're saying is it's really like it's an easy thing. It's an easy concept to understand, but when the rubber hits the road, it's sometimes really hard to do.
Yeah.
And there's no small amount of courage that goes into that as well, right? Like I think that like if I were to summarize some of what you and I are talking about today, Keith, it's that like developing executive presence is a courageous act. And that I kind of like, like I wasn't expecting that to come out, but that's kind of cool. That's kind of cool. Listen,
it is, there's a lot of elements to it that might be scary or fearful, right?
Yeah.
And courage is not about getting rid of the fear, right? Courage is about
doing it afraid.
Just courage is doing it, even though you continue to be afraid, you go ahead and do it. That's what courage is.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's really interesting about that is, if someone finds themselves in a situation where they know I want to develop executive presence and they're listening to some of the stuff and it's like, oh, I didn't think it was going to be that emotional or that goopy or whatever it is, right? And that's scary, that's weird. Well, the good news is that there are people out there who support exactly that, and I know that that's what you do, that's what I do. Building executive presence isn't necessarily easy, but it's an investment that's worth it. And I think that's really cool. Listen, I'm looking at the time.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, and sort of at the bottom, foundational stuff, and you pointed this out before, is building that self-assurance and self-confidence. And even believe me, even senior leaders, you talk to them about confidence and self-assurance in certain areas, and they go, yeah, I need to improve here. Wow. I'm telling you, it's there. And that's all about just building your self-awareness and understanding, where are some of your limiting beliefs and how do you gain different perspectives?
Yeah.
Right. You got to switch your perspective sometime and say, okay. Oh, now I get it.
Exactly. Listen, Keith, I could keep talking to you for like another hour.
Same.
But we're almost at time. So any last words that you want to leave folks with today?
I would just say that thinking about, and I'll put it in the context of career because I'm a career coach.
Sure.
The idea of continuing to work on executive presence, sure, but this idea of, what's limiting me, why sometimes am I not making optimal choices for myself, and understanding kind of what's causing that, which are some of your limiting beliefs, or at least they will feed into that. And, really thinking about that, whether you use a coach or not, but trying to, establish a deeper, learning about yourself. And we all need to do it. The human condition is we're constantly learning and constantly trying to figure ourselves out. And it's important whether you're reading certain leadership books or business books or get a coach or, talk to other, friends and relationships about issues. It's important to utilize whatever, whatever tools you can to continue to build your own self-awareness.
Yeah. Awesome. Keith, it's been a delight talking to you today.
Same.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me. Before we sign off, for the folks that are listening, if folks want to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. My website is KSM dash, not an underline, but a dash, coaching.com.
Okay.
KSM dash coaching.com. My direct email is keith@ksm-coaching.com.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And we'll put that into the comments on LinkedIn so that folks can get a hold of you. And I'm Todd Karges. You all know how to get a hold of me. I'm at toddkarges.com, or you can reach me here on LinkedIn. Keith, thank you again. And,
Todd, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Me too. Me too. Well, let's do it again.
Okay.
Thanks so much, everyone. And that's a wrap for today. We'll
All right.
see you again next time. Okay. Bye-bye.